No worries. All right, we'll start again. So I'm here at the Library of Virginia. I'm the Public Services Division Director. And I've also done a lot of work with historical music. And so I kind of right now combining these two interests that I have, one in recorded sound and music, and the other one in history. And a number of years ago, and I'm going to share my screen because I want to show you some pictures related to the story. So we are going to take a quick look through a little bit of Culpeper history and also history of music. So let me know, Andrew, if you can see all this quite well. How's that look, everybody?
Looks fantastic.
Okay. So, I should just tell you, in my title here, you see Jim Strother, who is on the left, playing guitar, and he's recording at the Virginia State Prison Farm. The other gentleman is named Joe Lee, and he was also a inmate there at the State Farm. We're going to do pretty much three things today. First, I'm going to talk about the recording session in 1936 by the Library of Congress, because really the only reason we know about Jim Strother is because he made these recordings, and some of them actually have become relatively famous. The second thing we are going to do is talk about the most tragic part of the story, and that is the murder of his wife, Blanche Green Strother. And then the third thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about the families involved. We do lots of work here at the library on genealogy, and I think it's always really important to understand the family history of the people that you're writing about. So that'll be the third part of my presentation. I also want to give a shout out to two people in Culpeper who've done incredible work to help me with all of this, really going above and beyond. And one is Zan Nelson. I think Zan's with us today, which is fantastic, who is just really introduced me to so much of this Culpeper history and helping make contact with some of the relatives of the people that I'll be talking about. The second person you may also know if you're from Culpeper, his name is Jeffrey Scott, and he's the nephew of a really well-known blues player who passed away in the early 2000s named John Jackson. Well, John was a big influence on me, and I actually wrote a marker, and which you can see in Rappahannock County where John grew up. And Jeffrey's also an excellent player. He's played at all kinds of venues, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, and he really has helped me understand the music in a way that I don't think I would otherwise understand it. So I mentioned the project I did, and it was to, this was years and years ago. I think it started in 2001. A friend of mine, Jan Ramsey, and she was working with a blues society up in Lynchburg, and we did a series of historical markers related to the blues. And this is the marker that I wrote for the 1936 Virginia prison recordings. This one is on Route 6 at the Virginia State Prison Farm, which has actually been shut down. I think it's got another use now. And this is the location where Jimmy Strother recorded. This is really the beginning of my search for Jim Strother. We had his music, but nobody really knew anything about him, where he came from, what his story was. But let's start with the music. This is his picture from our collection, the state collection of the Virginia State Penitentiary. He entered that system as a prisoner in 1936. One thing that this image really can tell you about his story, you see that kind of deep scar on his cheek and then a scar above his, I guess it would be his right eye on his forehead. Jim Strother was blinded in an industrial accident. And here's where he would have first entered the system at the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond. But very quickly he was transferred to the Virginia State Prison Farm. He was convicted of second-degree murder, but because he was blind, that was really the reason that he was transferred. So in 1936, John Lomax, who's probably one of the most famous folklorists in American history, got together with the Library of Congress, and he proceeded to go through the entire American South and record at every state prison in the entire South. Really quite remarkable. Now remember, this is the time before you can just plug in your tape recorder or have batteries. Well, you had batteries, but this is the setup he had in his vehicle to do these recordings. It was very difficult to do field recordings at this time. The originals, the discs from these recording sessions are at the Library of Congress. Lomax was a native Texan, and he had written a very well-received book on cowboy songs. And so he was well-versed in Southern folklore. And here he is shaking hands with one of the people that he interviewed and recorded. Coming with him was this gentleman, Harold Spivak, who would eventually become the head of the music division at the Library of Congress. But at that time was a fairly young man who had really a classical training in music. And he went on this recording trip with Lomax to the state prison farm in Virginia. And he writes about it. And it's one of the best accounts we have of this. One of the first things he writes about is coming to where the warden lived, which is this building here, which still exists on the site. And one of the things that happened there was the warden, of course, was waiting for him, and he brought out this quartet. And Lomax kind of whispers to Spivak and says, no, this isn't good, because he had very specific ideas of what he wanted to collect, and it wasn't what these guys were singing. But he noticed a gentleman with a battered banjo, and he engaged him in conversation, and Spivak says, for over an hour. And then the next day they came back and they recorded Jim Strother, as well as a number of other people who were incarcerated there. So I'm gonna, so some backstory that you will need to know to understand his music. Jim Strother was a street musician, as well as he worked in medicine shows. And both of those were the kinds of musical environments where you had to be versatile. Like you couldn't just like play one thing. You had to be able to satisfy a variety of different audiences: white people, black people, old, young, men, women. And so in this recording session, that is one of the things that really strikes you when you listen to his output, is that he played a variety of different kinds of music. And here are some examples, as you see. And I love this quote. This is a letter he wrote to the governor of Virginia, where he talks about what he could do if he was paroled. And he said string music. And that was a good term because he played banjo, guitar, and there's even some intimation from some other sources that he could play the violin, although he did not play fiddle on any of his recordings at the prison farm. You can see the microphone in front of Jim Strother and Joe Lee here. And I'm going to play you the song that they were performing when this photograph was taken. So let's listen. Well, before I do that, I apologize. I'll do that just in just a minute. I got a little out of order. So let's talk about those different kinds of songs. Labor songs. So some of the classic ones were these songs. This one's called Take This Hammer. And this is a song that people would coordinate their work movements to. Many recordings of these types of songs were made in these prisons because they were also used in the prisons to coordinate the work of the inmates, who often were doing heavy labor, particularly in agriculture, cutting down trees, and they called these hammer songs or axe songs. So this is a song that would have been sung while people were doing this. And this is a song that he would have heard because of the railroad system that ran through Culpeper town and county. And in fact, there was a labor camp, a railroad camp just outside of the town of Culpeper during the period when he was growing up. This is a scene from maybe about, I think this one is probably about 15 years after he left, But this is some planting going on at the state prison farm, and you see, of course, the animals and raising of crops. This is another thing that Jimmy Strother knew very intimately, having grown up in rural Culpeper County, as well as at the prison farm. He would have been very familiar with the sounds of agricultural work. So let's hear one of the labor songs. This is an interesting one because it is really, it is kind of a protest song. So let's listen to it and then we'll talk a little bit about it. The song was heard as I used to work for a tractor, and that tractor piece is a contraction of contractor, clearly from the context of the song.
Used to work on tractor, like Hardy was his name. Want me to make 4 loads a day, doggone you was lame. Went out early in the morning, got salted stayed all day. When I returned in the evening, these are the words he said. Why in the world is it been all day? Here's your money, get away with that mule and that boy bushel come. Old Mike Hardy, he was mad, get my money, and he got bad with that mule and that boy bushel come.
So there's a little bit of his song, I used to work for the contractor. This is a fascinating song. You don't hear these kinds of protest songs usually in, but definitely not in recorded commercial blues songs or African-American songs. But this is a really kind of a unique one, a very interesting one, and certainly reflects some of his own experience growing up. Another important source of his songs were the early spirituals that, of course, came out of the experience of the enslaved. Jim Strother's mother, Susan, was born in the 1850s, and there's every reason to believe that she was enslaved, as most of his elders would have been. And so people got interested in this as well, and this is a recording session that was held in Petersburg of formerly enslaved people singing spirituals. In fact, it was headed up by this woman, Susie R.C. Bird, who was one of the main interviewers in what are often referred to as the ex-slave narratives, where they were picking up stories of people who had lived under slavery. And this is a group of that Petersburg group. It was really beautiful image from our collection. So people were very interested in spirituals, and part of the reason was even during and after the Civil War, many of particularly white Northerners who encountered this music were absolutely fascinated by it and began to compile it. And this is the first printed compilation of these songs called Slave Songs of the United States, 1867. And they were collected in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, some in North Carolina and in Virginia. And one of the songs is Lord Remember Me. And that song had a long history. And one of the things, of course, I'm very interested in is tracing the history of the songs that Jimmy Strother performed. So now we'll hear he and Joe Lee's recording of Do Lord Remember Me.
Lord, remember me. Oh, Lord, remember me. Hallelujah. Lord, remember me. Oh, Lord, remember me. Oh, when I'm in trouble, fell off my knees when I was in trouble. Lord, remember me. I'm in trouble, Lord, remember me. Lord, you, Lord, remember me. Lord, remember me. Lord, remember me.
So there's a little bit of Do Lord Remember Me by Jim Strother and Joe Lee. Jim Strother is the low voice, that's called a baritone voice. He's playing guitar, as you can see. One of the things you may notice if you're a guitar player is he's playing left-handed, which is kind of interesting. And that percussive sound you heard, that kind of beating sound, almost drum-like, Joe Lee has a pair of probably either straws or sticks, and he's actually playing on the bass strings of the guitar in this rhythmic pattern while Jim Strother plays the guitar. It's called straw beating, and it's more typically applied to violin playing or fiddle playing. This is rather unique, really, to hear it applied to a guitar, and it creates this wonderful underlying, rhythmic pulse to the song. So Jim Strother, he did, I think, 4 spiritual songs, which are all really, really wonderful. And you can hear most of these on YouTube if you want to check them out. Another song he did is also recorded in early sources, including the Hampton Songbook. One of the things that happened after the Civil War is that many of the early schools like Hampton and Fisk, they organized their students into singing groups. And one of the reasons they did this was to raise money for the schools because, it was right after the Civil War in the South. And the Fisk group from Nashville, Tennessee really pioneered this. And many other groups followed, and the Hampton Singers were certainly one of the other very prominent groups. One of the songs that Jim Strother sings, he calls it "We Are Almost Down to the Shore," but it is called "Fighting On" in the Hampton Songbook. So there's an echo of these songs that probably, certainly came out of the antebellum period and would have been familiar to someone like Jim Strother growing up in the post-Civil War South. I should emphasize too, Jim Strother was born around 1880. And so he would have absorbed the music of his elders, again, people who had lived through enslavement. But he also, as a songster, as somebody that had to make a living, picked up on modern musics that were just emerging. I know this is probably a surprising image. His song, "The Blood-Stained Strained Banders," as it's sometimes interpreted, although other people think he's saying "the blood-stained banners," was covered by Jefferson Airplane under the title "The Good Shepherd." And so and there's a whole story about how that happened that's quite interesting. That really is about the folk process and how some of these songs, which were put out by the Archive of American Folk Song, the Library of Congress, migrated into the folk revival of the 60s. And that will be a prominent part of my book as well. Now we'll close here with some, I got 2 more songs to play you of other styles. "Going to Richmond" is a blues, and it's what we call an 8-bar blues, which was a common form here in Virginia. There's a very famous song that John Jackson used to play called the Red River Blues that is in this form. And this one is called "Going to Richmond." And I'm going to play you a little of that, and then we'll discuss a little bit of it. And because these are early recordings, some of them are not in the best technical condition. So I'll give you some words, and let's listen to "Going to Richmond."
Yes, an old teacher, and I believe my soul is sold. Oh boy. So don't you trust no young woman, no, where on earth you go. Yes, an old teacher, and I believe my soul is sold. Son, don't you trust no young woman, no, where on earth you go. Yes, your fair Brown will tell you that she love you all her life. Oh boy, meet another dude around the corner and really tell that same lie twice. Yes, your fair Brown will tell you, yes, she love you all her life. Meet another dude around the corner and really tell that same right way. Alexander women, I sure go do this fine. Got a handful of gimme and a mouthful of much fly. Alexander women, I sure go do this.
So a little bit of Going to Richmond. As we will find out later, this song is very autobiographical, and it is about his wife, Blanche, who was considerably younger than he was, and who had lived in Alexandria when they were married. And we'll get to that in the second part of our talk. So roots in Culpeper are interesting. And one thing I should mention is that a lot of the Culpeper newspapers were just put on our chronicling Virginia Chronicle website, and you can search them, and there's amazing stuff in there. And one of the things that I'm sure some of you Culpeper people know is that there was a place called the Wharf, which was basically the area down by the station, by the Waverly. You can see this quote mentioned the Waverly Hotel, and of course, part of Davis Street, which was the main Black entrepreneurship area. And then you can see he mentions all these neighborhoods, which were well-known neighborhoods, which were mostly in where African Americans lived. And you can see this is about the music that went on down on the wharf. And so Jimmy Strother was absorbing this music. And later he would go on to apply a lot of this music in his own profession, of course. Now, there was also a place called Cedar Hill Park that Henry Tolliver, who was another well-known African-American figure in Culpeper, ran. And we know that was also a place where music happened. And there were even excursions of African-Americans from Washington, D.C. who came down. So these are all ways in which, in his youth, Jim Strother would have absorbed kind of the music of the time. One other thing we have to talk about, and this is there's some difficult stuff in Jim Strother's story. We have to talk about minstrelsy, which includes blackface, unfortunately. And I will also warn you, some of his music is pretty hardcore. So if you go to YouTube, you may hear some expressions and other things that are certainly not something we would want to throw out there today. But it was part of the culture and part of the story. So I just have to throw that out there, particularly with some of these images. You can see this gentleman standing up. He's a patent medicine man, and he's selling to the crowd. And this image probably is a little bit earlier, but Ben Shahn, who was a photographer for the WPA projects, took a series of images in 1935. And you can see here's a performer with doing ventriloquism, obviously. And see the man that's standing or sort of lower next to him with the Indian headdress. And then look at the man leaning against the pole in the background. That is an African-American man who is in blackface. All of these medicine shows would have performances of music, juggling, all kinds of other things to attract a crowd. And then the medicine show man would make his pitch. And, I know it's bizarre to us, but a lot of it was marketed as Indian remedies. This notion that Indians had secret tonics that could cure just about anything you could imagine. So this would be an environment where Jim Strother would have traveled all over the place with these shows. And sometimes it got pretty dangerous. There were times that many traveling African-American musicians talked about where they got into situations where what we would call sundown towns, and they literally had to get out of that place by nightfall, or they would have been in serious trouble. So let me play you, and this is the final song I'll play you, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Culpeper story. This is Jim Strother's song, Tennessee Dog. And this one was really wonderfully covered by Mike Seeger, the great musician and folklorist. And it gives you a sense of the comedy songs that somebody performing in a medicine show would play.
I'm right here to save you. Ain't no catfish, ain't no hog, and I'm right here to save you. That dog, that Tennessee dog. Oh, his head is long, ears is flat, and there's some eating to the ball of Jack, that dog. Talk about that dog. He's the meanest dog I've come from Tennessee. Now he's more meat than any butcher dog meat. Takes more chops than a live on. He gets more rats than any other cat on the side of Mississippi River. That dog, that dog, that. Talk about that dog.
So that's a real quick swing through Jim Strother's musical styles. And of course, there are a total of 13 songs that he recorded. He was by far the most recorded musician at this session at the State Prison Farm. So now a little bit more background on why was it that Jim Strother was in the State Prison Farm. Zan Nelson and I did a wonderful tour. She showed me so many things I never would have found myself. And we were pretty sure that it's behind this house. There was a small cottage and alley in Culpeper Town where unfortunately the murder of Blanche occurred. So they were married in 1923. By this time, Jim Strother had moved to Baltimore. In fact, he'd moved up to the Baltimore area around 1900. And after he was blinded in the industrial accident, that's when he became a street singer. We know he was performing on the streets by about 1910. So he does that. He has a wife, Mary, in Baltimore, who unfortunately I have not been able to find out anything about what happened to Mary. But by 1923, while he's still living in Baltimore, he marries Blanche Green, who, and we'll talk about her family in a few minutes. And they settle down in Culpeper. In 1930 census, they're in Culpeper. He's listed as a musician at a dance hall. Again, because of his flexibility, he's probably playing a lot of different things. He might be going out to the countryside. Virginia had a really strong tradition of what they call house parties. People would simply, roll up the carpet and clean up the furniture, and they would host people and have drink and food. And then there were also some dance halls that I've been able to identify in Culpeper Town itself. And so he's making his living that way. Blanche is a domestic, and she is working for a family in Culpeper itself, in the town. She could walk to work probably in 2 minutes from where they lived. And this house is also within easy range of Tin Cup Alley, the wharf, all of that. So he's right in the center of things. So unfortunately, in April of 1935, Blanche came home, and he was angry that she had been out. One of the children accidentally told him that she had been to another man's home. She had had 2 children before she married Jim, and according to Jim Strother, it was one of the fathers of one of her children. And unfortunately, it became violent, and he shot her, and she lingered for a number of days at the University Hospital at the University of Virginia, and finally died. And he was arrested the next morning after the shooting and went before the grand jury. And they, not surprisingly, indicted him. And he eventually does change his plea. One of the interesting parts of the story is I've identified all the jurors in the grand jury, all of whom are very prominent people. Not surprisingly, the head of the public schools in Culpeper was one of them. And you can see here, he was assigned attorneys. C.M. Waite, who I think a lot of you probably know who that is. He had been the mayor of Culpeper at one point and the Commonwealth's attorney. And Burnett Miller Jr., who at the time he was representing Jim Strother, was actually in the House of Delegates. Unfortunately, and I think clearly he was advised, he did not have a trial. He decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder, 20-year sentence. And so that's how he ends up at the Virginia State Prison Farm. You know, the Southern justice system was, of course, totally stacked against African-American defendants. We all know that. Could he have gone to trial and maybe got a lesser charge? It was clearly a crime of passion. How was he advised? Later, in letters to the governor, he accuses his own wife of abusing him. The Commonwealth's attorney, this is in later correspondence in his pardon file, says, no, that wasn't true. He was the abuser, according to people, you know, the word on the street, if you will. So it's a really sad story of, you know, domestic abuse. And one of the things I really struggled with in writing the book is, you know, the only reason we know about this man is because he committed this really terrible act. So now I'm going to wrap up, and then I'm hoping we can have a conversation and talk a little bit about the story. This is a document that's in his pardon file. I wanted to find out, like, where was he from? You know, well, you know, what do we know about his family situation? And he had to, I don't know whether this was a common thing, maybe it was. One of the reasons he got out is because his, he was able to get William Taylor, who you see mentioned here, who's living in Baltimore, to vouch for him. In fact, William Taylor obviously had a close relationship with Jim Strother, as you'll see in just a second. And he said, well, he can come live with me if you let him go. And that was pretty persuasive. The Commonwealth's attorney, even though he didn't buy any of Jim Strother's story about what actually happened in the murder, he told you know, the governor when he wrote him back, he said, as long as he doesn't come back to Culpeper, basically, I don't care. So he did. He ended up going back to Baltimore, dying in 1948. You also see a couple other names on here. Sarah Truman is William Taylor's aunt. And we'll get into that in just a second. And then Susan Taylor and Lizzie Green down at the bottom are obviously close relatives. So Susan Taylor, we'll start there. Kind of remarkably, the people at the Library of Congress issued some of his recordings while he was still alive. Some of these, there were 78 record sets you could buy of this folk music from all the different recordings that the Library of Congress had made. And this is a letter that Benjamin Botkin, who is at the American Folk Song Archive, wrote to Susan Taylor in Clarkson, Virginia. I think if you're from Culpeper, you'll probably know where that is. It's down sort of on the border of Madison County. And you can see they're going to pay a fee to Jim Strother for the release of his recordings, and they're searching for him. He and Botkin and Alan Lomax write all of these letters trying to find him, and unsuccessfully, as you can see, because it's return to sender essentially. Well, so that was a starting point. Who's Susan Taylor? Well, this is a chart that I created. Susan Taylor was the wife of Charles William Taylor, and you have life dates when I could find them. She was a Toms, please correct my pronunciation if I get any of this wrong. I mean, I'm just going by what I see in the records, but sometimes it's spelled almost like Tombs, and I'm not sure how people in Culpeper pronounce it. But she married Charles William Taylor. You can see that Charles William Taylor and Andrew's parents are Mary Strother and William Taylor. So this is probably, really has to be the connection to James Lee Strother, which was his full name. And you see Andrew, the brother of Charles, has a son named William Taylor. You also see Frances Johnson, who married Andrew Taylor. She was from Maryland. And look at her death date and look at William's birth date, right? It's like, what, 4 months, his mother dies. And one other thing that this chart tells, and that plays into the story of Jim Strother, because he becomes kind of a father figure for William Taylor. Another thing that's important to think about here is, how does Andrew Taylor marry a woman in Maryland? Well, Charles Taylor and Andrew Taylor, like many people in the South, and particularly Virginia, North Carolina area, moved up into cities like Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and Baltimore. And in 1900, Charles and his family, with Susan and her 3 brothers, are all in the Philadelphia area working on section gangs, doing railroad work. We mentioned the railroad songs earlier. Andrew also makes his way up there, and that's how he meets Frances Johnson and marries her. And here's William Taylor writing to Governor Price, Virginia's governor, trying to get him released from the state farm. And it reflects that it's ironic, and this is one of the things that really kind of is hard to know how to handle in this story is, obviously he really was a father to this young man who had lost his parents, and I'm pretty sure that Andrew died fairly soon thereafter too. So he takes him on, and you see in the census Jim Strother and other relatives sharing the burden of taking in the children from when someone dies, or they move, or they have to go north to find work, or this restructuring of the Black family is a really important part of the story that I'm trying to tell. So even though he did this horrific crime within his own family, he also, he wasn't a totally evil person, obviously, I guess is what I'm trying to say. He also lived in one of the most difficult and really hardcore areas of Baltimore. This street is called the Lung Block. The Lung Block had the highest rate of tuberculosis in the entire city of Baltimore, and he lived about a block away from it. He lived on Walnut Street, which you see in the illustration. And this is from a housing study that talked about how all these, particularly migrants from the South, have been pushed into these really difficult situations in some of these older neighborhoods. And you have to remember, Baltimore had the first legal racial segregation neighborhood ordinance in the United States. So even though they were escaping the Jim Crow South, in some ways it followed them. And industry. This is where Jim Strother worked, at Sparrows Point. This is where he lost his sight, at Sparrows Point, this large industrial steelworks. This was the draw. This steelworks particularly actively recruited Virginia and North Carolina rural African Americans. They thought they made the best workforce, and they didn't particularly want to have foreign workers that you might see in a place like Pittsburgh. This building also significant to his story in Baltimore. This is the Maryland Workshop for the Blind. And we know that at some point he did kind of was forced into the Maryland Workshop for the Blind because of ordinances against street singing. Being a street singer, well, this is tough stuff. There were ordinances against, that police could pretty much clear you off the street for any reason whatsoever. Now, another family that's important to the story, of course, is Blanche's family. And so I did quite a bit of research on them. And you can see the chart here. Noah Green, again, born enslaved in Madison County, he eventually moves up from the Locustdale area up to an area called Cedar Grove, which is fairly close also to Free Union Baptist Church. And his son, Robert Lee, was born in Madison. By the way, he went by Lee. That's most people refer to him as Lee Green. And they had, Noah Green bought property as well as his son. So they had property. Another thing I found out was that Noah Green voted in the 1867 election, which is the first election where African-American men could vote. They were voting for Constitutional Convention delegates. Really remarkable. And you see how they kind of advanced themselves by literacy. You know, you had the Freedman schools and other schools that emerged. And this family, both of these families were out of the second generation literate. Jim Strother was not. He could not read or write. Another really interesting story in this family that I just found, Robert Dean and Lucy Hawkins. And this is very poignant, and it shows you how close enslavement was to even someone like Blanche. So Robert Dean's wife, Lucy, dies in 1912, and actually there's a little notice in the paper. Robert Dean, I think it's about a year later, gets on his horse, rides to the Culpeper courthouse, and he takes out a marriage certificate for the woman who had been his wife under enslavement. She had been sold. He didn't know where she was, and so he married, and she did too. But somehow they were reunited, and in his mid-80s, he remarries the woman who had been his wife under enslavement. And Blanche would have been alive when this happened, which kind of blows my mind. So as you see, Blanche married James Lee Strother. Here's their marriage license. They were married at Free Union Baptist, is where the family went. And Zan just did me an incredible favor of, we did get together with some of the Green descendants, and it was just I can't even explain what an amazing experience it was to see these places with them. It's the difference between doing paper history and, really the real history in people. The biggest question, and this is the question I'm gonna let people ask questions, and maybe we can talk a little bit. So the most difficulty I've had is actually untangling the Strother family. There are so many Strothers, and by the way, I don't know if I'm even pronouncing this right. Some people say Strother, some people say Strother, and sometimes you see it with a U. But remember Lizzie Green was on that document from his pardon file? Well, I think this is her. And her mother, Catherine, I think is Susan, Jim Strother's mother's sister. That's a little bit of guesswork. Catherine has a bunch of siblings, and they came out of Greene County, and their parents were Harriet and Frank. Catherine had brothers Addison, Extra, which is kind of an interesting name, and for genealogical purposes, nice, because it's a little unusual, because there's lots of Catherines and Lizzies and Susans and Franks and Harriets, but that was one that's easy to find. There was a Lee Green, a Lee Strother that we're still doing some work on. So there was fairly large family. And so anybody out there who might have some connections to these families or had done any work on this genealogically, I'd love to know about it. And one last thing, this is James Lee Strother's registration card for World War I. It says, as you can see on this side, blind both eyes on the right side. So of course he wasn't subject really to draft, but all men of a certain age had to register. And one of the things you also see is his nearest relative says Lizzie Strother, and she's living in Washington, D.C. As you might imagine, and it's true of many, many families, lots of people went up into D.C. as well. There's about 3 candidates for who that Lizzie Strother is, who I've been tracking. And that's kind of another part of my puzzle, trying to put that together. So that is, well, one last thing, and this is a real mystery. There's one document. This is his marriage to Blanche, which happened in Alexandria. He's, as you can see, he's living on Oak Street in Baltimore. She's living in Alexandria. She's working as a domestic in a white family there. You see his parents, Jim and Susan. That's the only mention of his mother's name. And it says James City, Virginia. Well, what the heck? James City County is down in the Tidewater near where I live. My guess is this is the James City, which is just across the border from Culpeper in Madison County. But that at this point is a guess. There are no Struthers in James City County. I have looked at the records. So that's my guess why this is in this record, but another puzzle to unravel. So now I'm going to stop the share, and hopefully some of you may have some questions for me, which I'd be happy to try to answer if I can. So Andrew, can folks unmute?
Yes, I've allowed everybody to unmute themselves.
Great. Great to say seeing lots of familiar names, which I'm very excited about. I see a Woolen. I know that one of the Green, the daughter of Blanche Green, married a Woolen and moved up to Alexandria. So anybody have any questions?
A question, Greg. I noticed that one, a man you said, I don't remember his name, was formerly enslaved, and he had a son who he named Robert Lee. And was that after Robert E. Lee? And why would that be?
That's a really good question. I rather doubt that. The Lee name seems to be quite common, both as a last name and as a first name in that area of Tidewater, of Piedmont, Virginia. So I think it's probably just a family name that may have come down. It's quite common as a middle name, as you can see, James Lee Strother. There was a Lee Strother who I think was probably his uncle. So I don't think so. I don't think that that's where that comes from. Other questions? You just unmute yourself if you need to.
Mr. Kimball, I'm afraid this is Clint Schimmer and Culpeper. I'm afraid I missed the top half of your talk, and I regret that. But did you indicate, or could you give me an idea, how long have you spent researching this?
Probably too long. Well, it's been a long time. It's one of those things where I wasn't doing it all the time, but it was like a sidelight that kept coming back, And I think it really accelerated probably in the last 3 or 4 years, where I really dug in a lot deeper. Working in a great archive like I do, I have access to a lot of these records, and so I could kind of pick my spots. But I would say getting together with Zan Nelson was a revelation, because it really got me into the local scene. So, and I hope Zan's still with us. Yeah, I can see her there. Because, I needed to know the geography. And that was a part that was, once I started getting into the genealogy, where was Clarkson? Where was Buna, which is a place where another Strother family member lived, and where was Cedar Grove? And so I'd say the last 3 or 4 years, it's been more intensive in terms of the research. Mm-hmm. I think it's, most academics will spend like 2 or 3 years writing a book. I feel like I want to just like really embed myself in it. And maybe I'm OCD. My mother and father probably would, if I had been born in the modern age, they probably would have diagnosed me. But I just want to know everything I can possibly know about how, these families and how they lived. And so I tried to dig in really deep.
Dr.
Other
Kimball?
questions?
Yes, Dr. Kimball. My name is Harry Strother Jr. and my dad is from Culpeper. And
Great. What is your father's name?
his name was Harry E. Strother. And they lived they had about 22 acres off of Mountain Run Road, off of 29.
That's fantastic. Do you know who your father's father was?
His father's name was Samuel Buckner Strother. His father's name was Felix Strother. And I've done the family tree. I'm still working. I've been working on it for about 10 years. And we have Blanches. We have a Blanche Green. We have the Taylors. We have all of the sub-names that you mentioned in your narrative.
That's very great. And by the way, I am absolutely happy to share any of the work that I've done. So I'd love to stay in touch with you, Mr. Strother. Feel free to drop Andrew a line and he can give you my email, or let's figure out how to do that, because yeah, I have collected a lot of material on some of the families, and I really want to share it. That's one of the great things about working at the Library of Virginia, is really what we're here for, is to share what we know and learn with other people. So I would be happy to do that, and I would love to see your lines too.
Okay, because in I think back in 2019, I did stop at the library in Culpeper because I live in Fort Mill, South Carolina right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm planning once things calm down, and planning on coming back to the library to try to start my research again. But I would love to keep in contact with you and share with you what I have found so far.
And I got my email address wrong. So forget that first one. This is the right one. Yeah, I would love to do that, Mr. Strother. That's fantastic. Yeah, again, I'd be happy. I followed some Strother lines that didn't pan out, but I spent quite a bit of time on them, so I'd be very happy to do that. And just to clarify too, although this is, of course, Culpeper Public Library's program, and I thank them again, I'm at the State Library and Archives in Richmond.
Okay.
So we have tons of records for Culpeper and all the surrounding counties. Although Culpeper also, the library there is excellent and does a great job with genealogy as well. In fact, I spent a couple of days there looking through the resources there as well. So great, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for mentioning that.
And one last note is that there are a lot of Strother. My family line, we don't use an S on the end of our name, but there are relatives who do. They came out, they are from White Shark. They use Strothers on their last name, even though they're first and second and third cousins.
I should have mentioned that too. Sometimes Jim Strother's name is spelled with an S.
Yes.
And also another thing you'll see is Dean and Green are frequently either have an E or don't at the end. So there is some variation in spelling. And the other thing is, for Googling, you want to look at some of the other music of Jim Strother. Use Jimmy Strother, because that's the name that the folklorist gave him. My feeling is that was kind of a stage name for him.
Mm-hmm.
You had, Little Jimmy Dickens was a famous country singer. But people primarily in documents, and even there's little bit of spoken word before one of his songs in the recordings, and the guy says, "Go ahead and start, Jim." So I'm pretty sure he went in everyday life, he went by Jim Strother. But when he was on the stage, he would go by Jimmy Strother. Thank you so much,
things
Mr.
just to
Strother. Yeah, let's
you.
do be in touch. That's
I
great.
will.
Sorry to interrupt. And I certainly Dr. Kimball, thank you so much for putting a little bit of a plug for Culpeper County Library. I do appreciate that. In the chat menu, by the way, folks, I did put my email address. So if anybody does need to get in touch with Dr. Kimball or has some extra information to share, by all means, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to pass that along and get you all connected.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Do you have time for a couple more questions, or do we
I
need to
have
wrap
plenty
up?
of time. It's all on you, Doctor.
Yeah, no, I'd love to keep having a chat if other people have questions.
Hi, this is Deborah Woolen.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. So I was introduced to this event by Zan Nelson. So Jenny Woolen is my grandmother, and her father is Willis Strother, who, from what I gather, so to bring it all together, Susie Strother is my my grandmother's grandmother.
Wow.
So would that mean that Jim Strother is my grandmother's uncle? If so, did you mention whether or not he has a brother named Willis? And Zan, if I'm getting the lineage wrong, please correct me.
No, it's a great question, and we'd probably need to look at it a little more closely to see if it is the same Susan or Susie, because it is a relatively common name, and I have identified, I think, at least 3 different Susan or Susie Struthers that I have records on. So again, I would love to compare notes with you, and we could see whether your family is connected. It is you may help me as well as Mr. Strother may as well, because you know, I've got some big blank spots, and it may be that they only can be filled in by people, you know, in the families who know these lineages.
Zan Nelson did say that Susie was a Terrell. That was her maiden name, and that is something that my grandmother has mentioned several times, that she was a Terrell. So
it could well be, and one kind of interesting connection too. And again, I know there are lots of Woolens in Culpeper County. There is we actually visited the Green homestead with relatives of Blanche Green down in the Cedar Grove area, and the name of the road is Woolen Road.
Williams Lane, yep.
Woolen Lane, yeah. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's probably connections, and I would love to talk to your grandmother also, just to get a kind of a feel for the environment, you know, what Culpeper was like. That was, when I met with the Green family, that was probably one of the most interesting parts, is just, you know, getting a feel for what Culpeper looked like then, and, you know, and you know, and what life was like there, particularly for, you know, African Americans in that time.
Sure, we have because of I think the documentation of Black history in Culpeper. I've been speaking with Zan, and we are scheduled to have a conversation with my grandmother, who's 94, who talks about Culpeper all the time. So, and I've mentioned this to her as well. So I'm going to talk to her in depth again this Saturday. So that'll be good.
I mean, this is one of the things I was hoping would happen in this talk. Really, I mean, it's just so wonderful that you came out, and I really do appreciate it.
Sure.
Cool.
So I'm hoping that that there is a connection there. So okay, so I guess that's my original question. So in his lineage, would that mean, or have you found yet, or if you perhaps you haven't found, whether or not Willis Strother would be his brother?
I have not.
Okay.
I do know of some other sisters and brothers based on Susan's census entries, but I have not seen that name. So, but that doesn't mean it's, you know how these things are. People moved around. You know, it's certainly possible. I mean, you got to remember, his mother was born in around 1853. So one of the things I found it in the Green Line, for instance, which was, you know, I only found because I found the death certificates of some of his children, of Noah's children, that he had another wife again, you know, under enslavement, and her name was Betsy Brock, and he had 2 children that I didn't even know about until I tracked, you know, got together with the Greens and they helped me sort through that. So, you know, what you have could be very useful to me. So we'll see if we can sort that out. And, you know, again, feel free to email me at gdkimball@cox.net. That's my personal email. And, you know, Andrew also can facilitate that. But yeah, let's keep talking. I really, really would like to talk to you and to your relatives.
Okay, I'll reach out to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you.
Miss Woolen
Anybody
and
else have questions?
Mr. Strother,
Yes.
just a sheer curiosity question. Have you looked into doing like a DNA type analysis? And Dr. Kimball, is that something that maybe you've looked into as well for some of this kind of genealogical research?
Well, just from my part, it is obviously a big element of it. And there's probably Katie Derby's on here. She probably knows more about it than I do. Well, of course, that's a decision that the families themselves have to make. And, you know, that's one of the things I should just say too. This is a tough story, you know, and again, I gotta thank some of my friends in Culpeper for negotiating that. I didn't know what the relatives, you know, reaction would be to this story because it's a tough one. And in fact, it turns out that Blanche's son never would talk about this episode with his own son. So, you know, it's kind of tough stuff. And so that's a real personal decision, but it's certainly a major factor in African-American genealogy right now. Mr. Strother, have you thought about that?
I've done both DNA tests for ancestry and the other 23andMe. Both of my parents passed away. Dad died in 2019. He was 94. And didn't get him to, he was from the old school, so he wasn't going to do the DNA at all. But on my family tree, I have identified at least 1,200
Wow.
relatives on the expanded tree.
Wow.
And but I'm at a dead end right now because I can't get beyond my I have 6 generations of Strothers now, or Strother, and I just need to get back to it. It's a lot of Strothers out there that black and white that that I'm still trying to identify.
Jerry, that's a great question. It certainly has been a real revolution in genealogy, that's for sure.
Hey, Greg, it's Katie.
Hi, Katie, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you. I have a suggestion. I think it might be helpful if we get the research you've done into some kind of online sharing format that'll allow everybody to view it and then make suggestions or add to it. It'll help those of us at Culpeper Library. If relatives or family members come in, we can refer to it and maybe add to or help people. And there's several options for that, but that would be a suggestion. My second suggestion, Greg, is that you plan on, after you publish your book, coming and presenting it at the Library of Congress here in Culpeper and doing a presentation to bring all of the archives together. I think would be great for the community as a whole.
I would love to do that. And that's such a wonderful facility. That's a really, really good suggestion. I see my old friend Brian Hoffa is here, who's actually works there as well. And I used to work at the Library of Virginia. How you doing, Brian?
Hey, how you doing, Greg? Thank you so much.
Good. Do you have those discs in your collection?
Well, you know, that's funny is I was patiently waiting to ask you, you know, seeing that John Lomax recorded it for the Archive of Folk Song, which is now part of the American Folklife Center. If you had contacted anyone from the LOC, either at AFC or Matt Barton, who's the curator of the recorded sound collection, because Matt Barton used to work with Alan Lomax before he came to the Library of Congress. So I was curious if you had any contact with them about these recordings. And also I wanted to say I'm really glad that this is being recorded, because it almost slipped my mind that this was happening, and I remembered at the last minute, but I don't think I was able to spread the word to other colleagues. So it's great to know that it's being recorded, so I can pass that link on to the YouTube link.
Yeah, I'm very glad it's being recorded too, and absolutely other people who've been able to join, do pass it along if there are other relatives or others. And yeah, the answer with the Library of Congress is absolutely. I did quite a bit of research at the downtown in DC at the Folklife Center, because they have the papers for John and Alan Lomax, the papers related to the Library of Congress programs. And
Sure.
so there is good documentation for this visit, this recording session, actually better than a lot of the other ones. And that photograph, that one iconic photograph of them recording is also part of the Library of Congress's collection.
Wonder how long this is going to go on.
And so let's see, Library of Congress. Yes, and just to mention a couple others. So I also, John Lomax has papers down at the University of Texas. I've talked to them. Did a lot of work at Maryland State Archives and some of the genealogy of the families in Maryland. I was lucky that the last visit I had to make to American Folklife Center, that I got home that Friday and COVID was really starting to hit. It was the last archive I visited, except for my own, the Library of Virginia. And I was lucky enough to almost get all of my research done before that happened. So
that's fantastic. It's really cool that you're working on this project, this book. I didn't really know about that. And I remember hearing about blind Jimmy Strother back in around 2001 or 2, or when I still have the CD somewhere. A track was included in a magazine on a sort of promotional CD for 64 magazine, which was like a thing that was briefly being published in Richmond. And I remember maybe you had something to do with that. Track.
I wrote that article.
Okay, you wrote the article.
And I know a heck of a lot more now than I did then, let me tell you. But that was a cool, it's interesting. So there were a number of people who did cover his songs. I mean, obviously, Jefferson Airplane is the most famous one. But there were a number of other artists who, like Tennessee Dog was a tune that Mike Seeger used to perform quite frequently. So like people knew about him. People in the folk revival, they did know about Jim Strother. And you mentioned blind Jimmy Strother, which again kind of was a stage name. One of the things I really want to take seriously in this book is his blindness. We are now having a real renaissance in disability history. And I tell this story to people sometimes. Back when I was writing that article many years ago, when you would tell the story about a blind man shooting his wife, you get these kind of nervous Twitter, of almost laughter, and of course, since then we've had the Me Too movement, and people don't do that anymore, kind of thankfully, because it's a pretty horrific thing that he did. But there's a lot of stuff. Amazingly, there's a lot of documentation of how people viewed blind musicians and how that affected them. One of the things that I learned was that there were classes of blind musicians in pretty much every traditional culture in the world. You know, you can talk about Irish culture with O'Carillon, or in Japan, they had these people called biwa singers. I mean, it was actually very universal. And so I really started to get into that part of the story in a way that I never knew that I would. There's a huge conflict in Baltimore where the head of the Confederated Charities tries to stop all of the blind musicians in Baltimore from playing on the streets, because he says it's beneath their dignity, basically, that it's kind of a shameful thing to be doing. And this is dust up in the newspaper about this. It's like really remarkable. So I really wanted to pay attention to that. I think that's an important piece of his story. Well, this has been, yeah, go ahead. This has been so fantastic. And I'm not going to run out on you, but if there maybe there's one or two final questions, I'd be happy to field them.
Well, I just wanted to conclude that thought about contacting the Library of Congress, and it sounds like you have already, but it's interesting because some of these collections that we have at the NAVCC, you know, have not been digitized yet. So, you know, this type of research is one of the main drivers of preservation work that we do. And so it's really good to hear about. And also, you know, some of the folklorists and the experts at the Library of Congress, you know, could benefit from the research that you've done. So it can work both ways.
I'm so excited about that. And, you know, one of the things that the digital revolution has been so important to this. When those Culpeper newspapers went up on our site, I was like in heaven, you know, to be able to keyword search these things. And Brian, just in the last, since you've been closed, there have been collections I needed to look at that have been digitized. And I have been working with somebody. There is one more collection now, and apparently it is out for digitization, and it's actually stuff that was recorded by Chuck Perdue. It's interviews and music from Culpeper and Rappahannock County, and it's based around relatives of John Jackson. And I really want to hear that stuff because some of the older people that are interviewed go back into the time of Jim Strother. And apparently it is in the queue to be digitized. So it's really exciting.
That's great.
That this is, you know, it's just amazing. I can remember when I wrote my first book, having to go through 20 years of microfilm of the Richmond Dispatch so that I could write my book, you know, and it's just remarkable. Okay, maybe one more question. Well, thanks for hanging in there. It's been really fantastic to meet some people from the community, and we'll hopefully be talking soon. And thanks to the rest of you, obviously, for coming out. I really appreciate it. And thanks again to Andrew and the library. And Katie, I will take up I think you've got a great idea there of finding a platform to get all this out. One of the things I've been thinking about with my book is actually to have basically a companion website, because, hey, you got to hear the music, right? So thanks again, Andrew.
Well, certainly, Dr. Kimball, thank you so much for joining us tonight and with your presentation. I know I'm floored. I think that's really the only word I've got to use for it. So fantastic. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll be able to read and see and experience everything else that comes out of this. To those of you who are on this evening, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we hope to have this recording up on the Culpeper County Library's YouTube channel sometime very soon. So please stay tuned to our Facebook page. That's where we will announce its posting. So again, for the Culpeper County Library here in Virginia, thank you all. And again, Dr. Kimball, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.